Lightroom Classic running slow. Lightroom Classic suddenly got slow. Lens profile slowing things down. Lightroom running slow. Laughably slow Lightroom Classic. My Lightroom is slow! I don't know. Anyways, I spend a fair bit of my time perusing the Lightroom subreddit just to see what's out there, what kind of questions, offer up my advice and recommendations, since I feel like I've got a decent amount of experience with Lightroom under my belt at this point. And one of the most common things you see on there is people lamenting the fact that their Lightroom is running slow, specifically Lightroom Classic. And Reddit's hardly the only place you see that. If you do a quick search online, you can easily find millions of results. I mean, heck, if I just jump over here to my search window and just type in slow Lightroom, I get over 5 million results just on that alone. If I search for how to speed up Lightroom, over 25 million results. So this is hardly a rare phenomenon out there, but there are some things you can do, actually several things you can try doing to try to get you some better performance regardless of what system you're running on with Lightroom Classic. Now, I'm not here to say I personally never experience any performance issues with Lightroom Classic. I certainly have run into some myself, but there's been several things I've done that have worked for me. And a lot of them, frankly, are things that Adobe themselves simply recommend. But what I want to do here is just walk through what's worked for me and also let you know some things that you might want to try to give you a little bit of a leg up in terms of Lightroom Classic performance on your system. I'm also not running some crazy powerhouse. I'm doing all of my processing on my Surface Book 2 here. It's got 16 gigs of RAM. It's an 8th generation i7 processor. The GPU is fairly solid, but it's certainly far from top of the line. It's an NVIDIA GTX 1060. And for the most part, I really don't run into too many performance issues within Lightroom Classic these days. Now, as I mentioned, part of what I'm doing here is just frankly exactly what Adobe recommends. And if you come into your preferences within Lightroom Classic and go to the performance tab here, there's a link down here for more performance tips. And if you click on that, it actually takes you to a page where Adobe themselves have a whole bunch of different tips and tricks and things you can try in terms of settings and configuration to help you optimize performance on your system. There's plenty of things in here that they themselves recommend. Now, I don't need to go through all of this entire page here. You can read this on your own. I'm not going to cover everything in here. What I'm going to cover is what's worked for me, to hopefully give you an idea of what you can try to get some speed improvements within Lightroom Classic. If you're still struggling, by all means, come out to this site that's linked within the performance tab and see what else is out there and give it a try. I can almost guarantee you that if there's things here you haven't done, you can see some sizable performance gains just by tweaking a few simple settings. Now, I'm going to be covering a fair bit here, so rather than just make you watch through the entire video to get everything, I do have chapters broken out below, so if you click on those, you can jump around. That said, I do recommend you watch the whole thing because there might be things in here that you're not familiar with or that you may not think apply to you, but would actually get you some sizable performance gains. So again, you can skip around if you want, but I do recommend you watch the whole video. And before we get into it, as always, I have to put the shameless plug out there. If you find this helpful, please do give the video a thumbs up. It's a great way to help YouTube know that this is a valuable video and deliver it up to other people that might be searching for help. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. And if you want to continue to follow along as I release new videos, turn on that notification bell as well so you know when I've got new content coming out. With that, let's just jump right on in. Okay, so bear with me. I'm going to be reading a lot off my notes here because there is a lot to cover. But so first things first is let's talk about storage and how that storage is connected. Now, obviously my Surface Book, it's got an internal drive, but it's an SSD or solid state drive, which if you're not up to terms on your technology out there, a solid state drive is essentially just a modern storage solution that replaces the old spinning hard drives of yore that are susceptible to failures, and they're very fragile if you drop them, so on and so forth. And along with that durability, you also get far faster performance. So it's virtually instant access times through an SSD, and your input-output performance, or how quickly it's able to move data back and forth, is roughly 15 times faster than your old school hard disk. So a huge benefit right there as you're storing your raw files and things like that. You want to make sure that you've got a very fast drive or a reasonably fast drive that they're stored on, as well as equally important is where is your actual Lightroom catalog stored, because that's where the data is being written to as you're processing your images within Lightroom Classic. Now, the key here is, or the caveat is, even if you're using a solid state drive, it's only going to be as good as it's connected connection to your system. So in this case, I've got my catalog stored on my internal drive of my Surface Book. And as I mentioned, it's a solid state drive, so I'm good there. But I keep all of my raw files on an external drive that's also an SSD. And actually, I've got an example right here. The great thing with this is I can take my files with me anywhere I go, and everything is just on this little itty bitty thing. This is actually a 2 terabyte drive. So extremely portable, it's durable. I could kick this thing across a parking lot and not have to worry about it being damaged. But if I'm connecting this via an older USB connection, like a USB 2.0 or something like that, if I had my catalog on here especially, that's really going to hinder my performance, because it's going to be transferring that data much slower back and forth between Lightroom and the data that's stored on this drive. So you want to make sure that you're connecting with a reasonably fast connection if it's not an internal drive or storage solution. In my case, I've got it connected through USB-C or the USB 3.1 protocol. If I look at my notes here real quickly, so yeah, USB 3.1, that gives me a max throughput speed for data transfers of 10 gigabits per second. That's twice as fast as USB 3.0. So just going from 3.0 to 3.1, there's a huge difference in terms of connectivity speeds. And I mentioned USB 2.0, which is the older protocol for USB connections. That is actually 25 times slower than the USB 3.1 I use. So you definitely want to make sure that if you've got a fast drive, that's great. But if it's an external drive especially, make sure it's connected with a good speed USB or Thunderbolt connection, depending on what your system's got, so that when you're moving between library and development mode within Lightroom Classic, you're less likely to encounter significant lag as Lightroom's trying to access those files, your catalog, and so on and so forth. So then that leads to, let's talk about previews and how those can impact your performance. So again, looking at my notes here in my importing tutorial that I put out, I think about 7 months ago now, one of the things I walked through is the different preview options that you've got in Lightroom. You've got smart previews, standard previews, minimal, one-to-one previews, all of those things and those decisions you make, whether as you're importing or as you go and create previews on the fly within Lightroom, all of those are going to impact the performance of your system as you're working on those files or navigating through those files with your library module in Lightroom. So for example, if you opt to create smaller previews or lower resolution, lower quality previews as you import, that can slow you down when it comes time to actually start working with those files, because now Lightroom suddenly is going to have to generate standard or one-to-one previews on the fly as you're working. So instead of just being able to quickly move between photos or zoom in and out or whatever, you've got to waste CPU cycles on generating those higher quality previews so that you can actually work and see your images at the quality you need to do that work. So if you don't already have either one-to-one or standard previews created, I do recommend that you do that. At least if you're not doing it during the import process, go ahead and do it on a batch of photos as you're working. So for instance, if I come over here to Lightroom Classic and I look at, for instance, let's come in here to my last shoot. So I've got 106 photos in this collection. If I didn't already have those previews built, but let's say I had already identified my 3-star images, these are the ones I want to work on and see what I can do with, et cetera, et cetera. What I could do is come in here and select all of them within the library module. This doesn't work in the develop module. You have to be in library. But if I select all these, then I could come up to my library menu and choose to then build my standard size previews or my one-to-one previews, and do that before I even start working. That way, again, as you're moving from file to file or doing your actual processing adjustments, you're not waiting for Lightroom to generate those previews on the fly. So just a little tip there. Previews definitely can make a big difference. Let me look through this real quickly, make sure I've covered everything. Right, the most important thing. Something else you can do within your preferences on Lightroom. And again, I talk about this in the importing video, but if you come into preferences and go to your performance tab up here, and I think on Mac, performance might actually be a separate menu option. I'm not sure, but if you don't see it within preferences, just look around through the menus, you'll find it. But anyways, one of the big things you can do as well to help with performance is under this develop field here, you've got a couple of options. But the big thing here is use smart previews instead of originals for image editing. So what this does, again, if you haven't already created smart previews, it'll generate those smart previews. And then while you're editing, it's using that lower resolution, but still high quality preview, smart preview file as you're processing the image instead of the one-to-one file, which obviously is pushing a lot more pixels and data. This makes a significant difference for a lot of people. Now, there is a disclaimer here. This will allow increased performance, but may display decreased quality while editing. Final output will remain full size / quality. Now, frankly, can you see a little bit of a difference while you're editing in terms of the quality using smart previews versus the original? Yes, but frankly, it's so minimal. I don't find it to be an issue. Occasionally I'll disable it or remove the smart preview as I'm working, but that's probably not even 0.1% of the images I've worked on. I felt the need to do that. So this is a biggie. If you're not using smart previews instead of the originals, come into your performance section, go into the develop section and give this box a tick to start doing that. And I think that alone, you'll probably see some sizable gains in terms of performance. All right. So number 3 is your display size and your resolution. And this one, there's a lot of, if you go and dig into the weeds or fall into the weeds, whatever, you can get into a little bit of a rabbit hole with this one. There are some who are very firm believers that you actually don't want too high a resolution of a monitor or display for a few different things. A lot of it has to do with sharpening and if you're going to be doing printing and things like that. I don't want to get into all that here, but let's talk about how your monitor choice and your resolution settings can certainly have a big impact on the performance within Lightroom Classic. I've got the BenQ 270C. It's linked below. Shameless plug. If you make any purchases through those links in my description, I do get a small little commission off of those at no cost to you. So if you want to support me, blah, 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 blah. But anyways, I went with the BenQ 270C and I intentionally did not get a 4K monitor. Two things is that debate about sharpening and print and everything and whether you can do all that effectively with a higher resolution monitor. But the bigger piece is going with a 4K monitor versus a 2K monitor. I'm just having to push that many more pixels with my system, my CPU, my GPU specifically. So I opted to go with the 2K display, which is, in my opinion, a great display, more than sufficient, a nice bump from 1080p, but I don't feel like I have some of the drawbacks that some people feel you do have with those higher resolutions. So this is a 1440p monitor, or essentially 2K, falls in between 1080p and 4K. Now, that said, if you've already got, or you just want to get a 4K monitor, let's say you're also a gamer and you want to play gaming in 4K or whatever. If you've already got it or you're hell-bent on getting that 4K monitor, make sure you've got a good GPU. One of the things Adobe's done a lot on, and we'll talk about this towards the end of this, is leveraging more and more the GPU to help with your development settings and processes within Lightroom. So if you're going to be getting that higher resolution monitor, you've already got it. You want to make sure you've got a GPU that is going to be able to quote unquote push all those pixels you're displaying compared to a 1080p or a 2K monitor. So just keep that in mind if you're going to be making a monitor purchase down the road. I personally would recommend sticking with no more than a 1440p, but ultimately, you've got to weigh the pros and cons of that and what other use cases you may have. But just keep in mind, the more pixels you got to push, the more of a load that is on your system, and you're more likely to run into performance issues. And actually, I just helped a friend last night. He was running into a lot of performance issues. He's trying to use a Wacom tablet, I don't know how you say it. But anyways, trying to use that with Lightroom and Photoshop, and the brush was lagging horribly. Had him implement the smart previews for developing, had him bump his resolution from 4K to 2K, and everything's running way smoother. So again, just things you've got to take into consideration. Number 4, turn off sync. So even though Lightroom Classic is not built around the Adobe Creative Cloud, you can sync smart previews up to the cloud and use those on your mobile device, an iPad, another computer, whatever, and have those accessible for viewing, for exporting. Again, they're not going to be the full files because it's smart previews, but exporting a reasonably decent JPEG out of that. But Adobe does recommend that you come up to this upper right corner, and if you come to this cloud icon and give it a click, currently I've got syncing turned on. Now, anytime I am working within Lightroom Classic, specifically anytime I'm processing an image in the develop module, I will always come up here and pause my syncing. The reason being is when you've got your syncing on, literally every adjustment you're making, even if it's metadata adjustments, ratings, keywords, anything like that, but certainly any processing adjustments as well, brush strokes, local adjustments, color adjustments, it's having to process every single one of those and then sync it up to the cloud and do that over and over and over every time you make an adjustment. If you undo something, it's got to sync it up and undo it. So that takes quite a bit of a draw on your CPU. So invariably, if I'm running into some oddball performance issues, just little hiccups here and there, it's oftentimes because I forgot to come up to this upper corner and turn off my syncing. So typically what I'll do, I'll go through, I'll do my editing, processing, whatever. And then when I'm ready to step away, I just come back in here and again, just click on the cloud icon again, start syncing. It'll scan through your catalog and see what changes you've made, sync those up to the cloud, and you're good to go. Then when you come back for your next session, just sit down, turn off that syncing again. And again, I think you'll see a nice little performance boost just from that alone. It doesn't seem like it would be one of those things that would make a difference, but again, because it's got to process every single little change you make, it's constantly taking CPU cycles away from the rest of the program just to sync those things up to the cloud on an ongoing real-time basis. All right, another biggie here is optimizing your catalog. Now, if we come back up to preferences and come into our catalog settings, there's a couple things, and I'm kind of going a roundabout way here, but if you go into catalog settings first, within here, you've got your backup option, backup catalog, and then if you click into this drop down, you can do it never, definitely don't recommend that. Once a month, once a week, once a day, every time Lightroom exits, when Lightroom next exits. So I've got this set that every time I close down Lightroom, it automatically prompts me if I want to back up my catalog. Now, an important note here, this is not backing up your catalog to the cloud or anything like that. It's simply creating a duplicate file or a duplicate copy of your catalog so that if your actual catalog becomes corrupted or damaged or you accidentally delete it or whatever, you've got a backup of that to go to. But if your hard drive fails, your backup is on your hard drive. It's gone just as well as your actual catalog file is. So please don't get this confused with a backup process that is syncing it up to the Creative Cloud. It does not do that. It will not do that. You have to still have an actual backup process in place. For me, I use Backblaze. Again, I've got a link below to that. It's dirt cheap. It's $60 a year. Unlimited storage. You get 30 days of versioning. So if you happen to have a file that gets corrupted, you just go back to the previous version of it within Backblaze. You can download it, or they can send you a drive if you've lost your whole drive. Anyways, again, a rabbit hole that I don't want to go into here. I do have a video where I talk about the backup process a little bit. I'll link that. Don't get that confused. This is not a true legitimate backup process. Yes, it's creating a copy of the file, but same thing. If your hard drive fails, if your laptop catches on fire and burns to a crisp, it's gone. You truly don't have a true backup. So just a caveat on that. So anyways, I've got this set up that every time I close Lightroom, it's backing up my catalog. As part of that process, it also optimizes the catalog. It actually optimizes the catalog and then it creates the backup. That's all well and good, but I don't necessarily want to have to close down Lightroom to optimize the catalog. And Adobe actually recommends that you optimize your catalog anytime you do an import, especially a larger import with a larger number of files, as well as anytime you've been working in the develop module for a while and making a lot of adjustments on one or several files. They recommend that you optimize your catalog, just kind of clean things up and help it work more efficiently. So you've got this setting here in your catalog settings in terms of prompting you to create that backup copy. And part of that is it optimizes the catalog before it creates that duplicate copy of it. But if you want to just optimize on the fly, simply come up to your file menu and you've got optimize catalog here. Click into this, it shows you when you last optimized it. So in my case, it's been now 9 days essentially since I optimized my catalog. Simply hit this. It does take several minutes to run, so I'm not going to do it here, but this does make a difference. Again, it's one of those things that not many people realize is out there, that with a simple button press, optimize that catalog. Maybe it takes 5-10 minutes, but you come back and things should be running a little bit more smoothly. And again, anytime you do some imports or a decent number of development adjustments on an image or a group of images, you might want to come in here and just do a quick optimization to keep things running smoothly. All right, moving on from there, another thing that's out there on that Adobe Performance Tips site, and again, if we come back in here to Preferences, and we're still on the Performance tab, so we're good there, is coming in here and looking at your camera raw cache settings and the maximum size on here. Now, I think the default for this is 5 gigabytes. Don't quote me on that. It's been a long time since I've had it at the default value. You can increase this cache size, and a lot of performance tips out there, I think Adobe even recommends, bumping it 25 to 30 gigabytes. If you've got the space on your hard drive or your SSD, go ahead and bump it up to 20 gigabytes, 25, 30 gigabytes, and see if that makes a difference. It's just giving more storage for that caching of files so that as you're working, it can pull from that cache quickly instead of having to go to the original files and all the other things that, frankly, I don't know what all it's doing. But just know that the size of your cache file here may make a difference. And if you bump it up to a fairly good size, it may make a difference in your performance as well. So again, Tip number 6. Let's move on to number 7. So this is another one that's kind of a biggie. This again is based on Adobe's recommendations, and that is your order of develop steps. So what does that mean exactly? So if I come over here and I'm in my develop module, one of the things I've talked about before in my customizing your Lightroom workspace video is the fact that I've reordered these sections to not only match my workflow, but also match a little bit better with Adobe's recommended workflow in terms of your order of development steps. So what does this mean exactly? So per Adobe's own recommendations, when you start working through a file, like for me personally, I typically will come in and I'll do my cropping first. Then I immediately move to spot removal and doing that cleanup for a couple reasons. Is A, it's one of Adobe's recommendations from a performance standpoint, but B, it's also going to be the most accurate when you do it before you start applying all kinds of adjustments, local adjustments, etc., etc. Then I would come in and apply my lens corrections. Then after that, Adobe recommends you stick with your global adjustments. So that would be primarily your basic adjustments, exposure, highlight, shadows, maybe your color adjustments, things of that nature. Then move into your local adjustments. So your graduated filters, radial filters, and your brush adjustments. The more of those you add onto an image, the more that's going to cause things to start bogging down. I've got some images, especially back when I did a little bit more intensive processing where, I might have 5 to 10 brush adjustments and maybe 3 or 4 radial adjustments and a couple graduated filter adjustments. Those are the types of images that the further I get into them, the more things start slowing down a little bit. So you want to do those after you've done your global adjustments. And then the biggie here is, whoops, accidentally scrolled here. So the biggie here is the last thing I absolutely do, and I don't do this until I am confident I am done with my processing of an image, is coming into the detail panel. And this is why I've got this detail panel at the very bottom. Is by default, Adobe's got some sharpening already applied. Your default settings at 40 on the amount for sharpening. So you can actually disable this panel completely to get some performance gains. Now, if you've got a lot of color noise in an image, you may not want to disable the panel completely, but maybe, drop your sharpening down to 0 while you're working on the image. Then at the very end, as your last step before you export, or whatever you're doing with the file, then come in and make your sharpening and noise reduction adjustments. These two things, if you make these adjustments and then try to continue to work on an image or do these first or in the middle of your processing, this is going to make a huge difference in terms of the performance on your system because of just the nature of the adjustments being made here in this detail panel. So make sure you're doing the detail piece at the very end when you're certain you've got your processing done. If you do need to go back and tweak and you're having some performance issues, again, you can disable the panel completely by turning off this toggle. But if you don't want to do that because it's introducing too much of that color noise that's applied by default, maybe just take down your sharpening slider to 0, go in and make some adjustments, and hopefully that'll be enough to get to the performance bump you need. And then you can go back to your final detail settings when everything is all said and done. Moving on from there, number 8, general housekeeping. Make sure you're not running around complaining about Lightroom performing horribly and you're running 3 versions behind. I see that a lot on Reddit and forums, Facebook, whatever, where somebody's griping about, Lightroom's running so slow, or I did an update on Windows or whatever, and now Lightroom's acting wonky, crashing, whatever, but they haven't updated Lightroom in a year or 6 months or whatever the case may be. So as of today, when I'm recording this, if I come into my About Lightroom Classic, current version is 10.1.1. If you're still running version 9.4 or 8.1, or God forbid you're running a cracked version, shame on you. Don't expect to get all the performance benefits that Adobe has been rolling into the newer versions. Obviously, if you're running an older version and they've added more GPU support in version 10 or version 9 and you're on one of those older versions, you're not getting that benefit. So make sure you're keeping your version of Lightroom updated through the Creative Cloud. Now, that doesn't mean you need to go out on day one and update. I used to kind of hang back for a week or two and see what's going on. Now, as I'm doing tutorials and that, I typically install the updates from day one, and knock on wood, I haven't run into too many issues with that. But sometimes, like with any software, the newest version, there can be some bugs that they don't catch during testing, and you run into issues, blah, blah, blah. Doesn't mean you got to update as soon as an update's made available. but do so within a reasonable period of time. Don't wait 6 months or a year because A, you might be missing out on functionality. If you're still running on Lightroom 9.4, you don't have the new color grading features in terms of the color wheels and things like that replaced split toning. You don't have the new zoom functionality. And again, they added some performance enhancements into the latest version. So keep updated and keep up with it so that you're not falling behind and missing out on the enhancements they are making, because it is one of the things they're focusing on. And there's a lot of noise out there about performance issues with Lightroom. Adobe does seem to be taking that to heart, maybe not as quickly as we would like, but almost every release they're doing something to help boost performance. And a lot of that, again, goes back to your GPU and leveraging that more and more. So keep updated. And that goes to your operating system as well. So same thing, if you're running on an outdated version of Windows, or you've got your GPU drivers, you haven't updated those in months on end, quite likely you're going to be running into problems there as well. Now, again, I'm not a Mac user, I'm a Windows guy. My understanding is Mac OS controls all of your GPU drivers, so you can't go out and install them directly from NVIDIA or anything. But one of the things I actually do here to make sure I do have the latest versions, since I'm running NVIDIA GPU, is I come into GeForce Experience and go to my drivers section. I make sure, do I have the latest NVIDIA Studio driver? Now, that actually calls out a note here. Let me see, where is this? So if I come in here and I click on this little 3-dot menu here, I'm given this little menu here. Choose your driver preference, game ready driver or studio driver. The studio drivers are maximized essentially to play well with the Creative Cloud apps from Adobe. So I've been using the studio driver for probably well over a year now. And then I make sure I'm up to date. And I've got automatic updates applied here, so I don't have to worry about it. This is all tied together. When Adobe doesn't update, NVIDIA doesn't update. These studio drivers, especially, pretty much every time there's a Creative Cloud app update, there's going to be an update to your NVIDIA Studio driver as well. So that's a biggie. Make sure that you're not letting things, whether it's, again, your operating system, your GPU drivers, your version of Lightroom, have good housekeeping, keep that stuff updated on a regular basis, and you should be good to go. Kind of sort of tied into that is number 9, closing out other apps. So like right now, obviously I'm jumping around and showing some different things, but I've got 2 browser windows open. The one I've got a million tabs open on it. I've got my task reminders, so on and so forth, screen recording software, blah, blah, blah. I'll come in here and I'll close everything out that I don't need. So if I'm working in Lightroom and I don't need any other program open, every other program is closed. Even to the point of I use OneDrive to back up my files and everything. I'll come in here to OneDrive and I'll pause the syncing just so that that's not pulling cycles. It's kind of like the cloud sync in Adobe Lightroom, right? So if I'm making adjustments to files, and some of these I do have stored locally, for like my catalog, for example, is stored locally on my internal drive, and that's backed up to my OneDrive cloud storage. So if let's say I optimize that catalog or I create a backup in the midst of my workflow and then come back into Lightroom and continue working, that's going to be syncing up to the OneDrive cloud. And that's just taking CPU cycles away from what I'm trying to do. So kind of in line with the general housekeeping or good housekeeping, make sure you're not running a whole bunch of other programs, going to Task Manager or whatever. Make sure you don't have something else running that's pulling away from a RAM standpoint, CPU, GPU, all that good stuff. Another one, and this is going to feel like a bit of a head scratcher. If you're having issues with Lightroom Classic, use Lightroom. What the hell does that mean? So I haven't talked about this in a video really. I've been very vocal about it on Reddit and things like that when people are confused about the different versions of Lightroom and why you would use one over the other. I am a huge advocate of Lightroom Classic. It meets my needs. It's got the file management tool set that I use and rely upon. It's got range masking. And then there's probably 3-4 dozen other little things that you encounter that Lightroom Classic has that Lightroom doesn't have. And when I'm saying Lightroom, thanks to Adobe's ridiculous naming convention, I'm talking about Lightroom, the one that's cloud-centric, the new version of Lightroom. So if I come in here, I've got my LRC app icon versus just LR. If I open this up, this is the new cloud-centric version of Lightroom. It's new modern code on the back end, but it's designed and centered around the whole concept that you're going to be storing your images in the Adobe Creative Cloud. Now, I don't use this as my primary, so I don't have my full files stored in the Creative Cloud. And actually what it's doing here, I don't know when the last time was I opened this version of Lightroom. So now it's trying to sync all my smart previews down. So this goes to my previous point about the previews, is I can use Lightroom Classic as my main Lightroom hub, but have those smart previews synced up to the cloud. So if I want to look at them on my phone or a tablet, or open up and use the newer version of Lightroom or on another computer or whatever, I can certainly do so. Now you can see in the upper right corner, it's chugging through my sync here, so it's got to pull all those files down. But because this is more modern code, it does tend to run a little bit better. So if push come to shove and you're just totally stuck and none of the things that I'm talking about here or the additional tips and tricks that Adobe's got outlined on that page you can get to through the link in the Performance tab, if none of that is working out for you, go ahead and give this a try. You just got to be aware of the fact that it's not intended to be a replacement to Lightroom Classic. And again, the naming convention is just terrible from Adobe. Lightroom Classic doesn't mean old, unsupported, being taken away or anything. It's just different. You almost think of it as Lightroom and Lightroom. Somebody on Reddit actually refers to the cloud-centric version as Lightroom Junior. It's not meant to be a replacement. It doesn't mean it's bad. It's just different. But because it is newer, it's a little bit more optimized in terms of the code on the back end. So push come to shove, if you're absolutely stuck, give the new Lightroom Cloud version a try, the one that just says Lightroom, not Lightroom Classic, and maybe that'll get you over the hump. Now, again, it's not going to have everything that you may want to use. It does not have range masking. I don't believe it's got color labels. It doesn't have some of the keyboard modifiers that I use on my processing a lot. It doesn't have a print module and things like that. So it depends on what your needs are. If you're just doing relatively basic editing and you're not worried about all the file management that comes along with Lightroom Classic, then this may totally meet your needs. But if you're going to switch to it, you just got to go in eyes wide open that it doesn't have all of the features, including some of the editing tools that you might be used to using or that just may exist in Lightroom Classic, whether you use them or not. Okay, so one last big tip. What I've talked about throughout this video several times is what Adobe has done to leverage the GPU. Almost every release over the last 2 years, in the release notes, they talk about leveraging the GPU more for this or that, for local adjustments, for spot healing. I think they've added it into, and of course right now I'm drawing a blank, but they've added GPU support and optimized GPU support for a lot more than what they had in the past. So one of the things you need to make sure of is coming into your preferences, and then that Performance tab is right at the top here. You've got Camera Raw. Use graphics processor. You can click to learn more, and B, it'll show you your setup here as it stands. So mine is set to auto, so it's automatically looking at my GPU and determining, is it capable of driving Lightroom Classic needs and to what end? So in the past, it used to really be primarily used for just displaying of the images. And again, now they're doing more and more utilization of it for the actual adjustment tools. So if I come in here, I've got auto, customer off. I can tell you, and I've had to do this within the last probably 9 months, there was an NVIDIA driver update that just did not seem to jive well with Lightroom. So I had to come in here and I couldn't get the game ready drivers to work well with it. I couldn't get the studio drivers to work well with it. So I actually turned off the GPU acceleration completely within Lightroom. It was awful. I think it lasted for like 10 days until NVIDIA got updates out. The difference it made for me on my system was pretty, I don't know that extreme is the right word. We'll just go with very significant. It was night and day having that GPU enabled versus disabled. Basically, it was so bad I didn't want to edit for that period of time until it got fixed. So I'm not going to turn it off. But if I come into custom, you get some other things here. So I can use graphics processor custom. And again, you can click into here and learn more. You can see by default, it's already selected for use GPU for display. So like I said, historically, most of the GPU utilization was just for rendering of the images on screen. It wasn't really used for a lot of the develop adjustments. But the GPU in my Surface Book, the GTX 1060, is sufficient and supported for those additional development tools. And that's where I could turn this off if I wanted to. Again, I don't want to. But I could turn it off and just have it used for the display functionality. But this will tell you if your GPU is supported that you can enable this. And again, if you put it on auto, it should automatically be enabled. But it'll then leverage your GPU for those develop tools as well. Again, local adjustments, spot healing, and whatever else that I'm still drawing a blank on. Now, you do note here that you've got to be using process version 5 or higher. Let me back out of this real quickly and we'll talk about that. If I come into my calibration panel here, as Adobe releases updates over time, they do have different process versions. Now, this is kind of the engine that runs all of this. So, version 5 might be better at rendering your raw files. It might be better at noise reduction and color management and things like that. Just know that your newer versions are typically going to be your best. If you've got older images in your catalog and your collections that you've imported 2-3 years ago from when version 4 was the standard, they'll still probably be on version 4. So as you edit, you can check this calibration panel and see what version you're running on. If you want to get the most out of your GPU, you got to be on version 5. And all you got to do at that point is come in, click on this, and if it's on version 4 or 3 or whatever, just click version 5, it'll update it. I think you can actually set it so that it'll show you before and after of any differences in how the image appears after you apply the newer version. But this is a biggie. If you've been working in Lightroom Classic for years, it's possible that a good chunk of your catalog is still on those older process versions. I believe it does prompt you if you want to just do it on the currently selected photo or all of the photos in the collection. So you do have a way to do it in batch, if I remember correctly. And I believe that is it. So the GPU piece, I cannot understate enough. If I had to tell you to try 3 things first, it would be use your smart previews for the develop module. If you're struggling, turn down the resolution or dial down the resolution on your monitor. If you're working with a higher resolution monitor, again, if you're on 4K, drop it to 2K. If you're on 2K, drop it to 1080p. That can be a biggie because you're talking about, going from 2K to 4K, you're pushing twice as many pixels at 4K. So think of the difference that makes in terms of performance standpoint. And then probably the biggest out of all of those, in my opinion, is making sure that your GPU is sufficient enough. If you're on a desktop, maybe you got to upgrade it or whatever, if it's worth it to you, but making sure your GPU is enabled within your performance settings, and specifically that it's on that auto setting and enabled for the specific develop functions or tools so that it's being leveraged for that and not just the displaying of your images. All right. This has been a long one. I knew it would be going in. That's why I wanted to split this into chapters. But these are the things that, as I've been playing with Lightroom, and especially when I was on my old Surface Pro tablet, that thing, it's respectable. It was a Surface Pro 4. It's certainly not a powerhouse. So performance was a bit of a challenge for me at times. So I really dug in and tried all of these different things and the tips and tricks that Adobe's got out there. These are the ones that I've just walked through that have worked best for me. Again, I can't promise they're going to work best for you. Millions of different systems out there and configurations and hardware and everything, but give it a try. If these don't work, check that link within the Performance tab to see what else Adobe recommends. There are several other things out there that you can try. So with that said, I'm going to shut up. I need to get a drink. My mouth is really dry. But I hope that this gives you some pointers and some tips and gets you some actual true to life benefit if you're struggling with performance in Lightroom. If it did, again, I'm going to please beg you, give the video a thumbs up. Please subscribe to the channel, turn on channel notifications so that you know as I release new videos. And as always, until next time, take care, everybody.